So one of the things that you learn when you're taking part in these kinds of symposia is to make sure that folks that know more about the subject than you do get the time. So what I'm going to do is be very brief and hopefully cede over about 5 minutes of my time and just see if there's some concluding remarks either for Dr. Chajua or for Mr. Mays. Because if you're coming to this as an infant, I'm coming to this as a zygote. I've read the autobiography. I have a sense of Malcolm X, but there's a deep knowledge, and there's some engagement, I think, both in terms of thinking about the subject and how to frame Dr. Marable, the late Dr. Marable's efforts. I do want to put in here, let's consider that the brother was close to passing away as he was finishing this up. So in the sense that there's some lapses and problems, that may be something that has to do with the circumstances of wanting this book out before he was gone, and as it turned out, of course, he didn't even live to see the actual publication of it. That does not mean that we should not engage it critically, rigorously, and bring up exactly the kinds of points that have been brought up during this panel and were brought up during the morning, as I understand. This is healthy, this is important, this is the way that we get back into the subject. I've already taken up a minute that I shouldn't, but I do want to be brief and make sure that I come back with a little bit of time, because I know we have to get out of here before 5, because the door does close, as I know from past programs here at Harsh and the Woodson. Look, I think we have to make a distinction between a book we like, a book we understand as embodying everything that we would like to see have been accomplished, and a book that is important. A book that actually allows a reconvention of a conversation, puts some key ideas out, and that we're able to engage the subject and some subjects beyond that in a powerful way. That said, I think particularly the points that were just brought up by Dr. Chajua about thinking about the problem of in what ways this book is coming out of the traditions of black studies is a very, very powerful critique, and one that I understand is coming from a number of different reviews. Manning Marable was an important practitioner of black studies and an important institution builder of black studies, but that does not mean that he automatically writes a book that advances the black studies tradition. So this is one of the reasons why I'm serious about giving over some time, is that I really want to hear that elaborate a little bit more and want that to be hopefully part of the discussion that we have as we close this out. I want to talk about 3 words, and I think these 3 words, in my estimation, are advanced and developed and deepened in terms of our understanding as a result of what Dr. Marable did, and as a result of the kinds of conversations that are emerging out of this book. The 3 words are politics, humanity, and revolution. Politics. One of the things that's striking to me about this book, and it's another one of the revisions that Dr. Marable proposed in relation to this book, and I think it's important to assess as fully as we can what he accomplishes as well as what he fails to accomplish, is that he wanted to go beyond, certainly the autobiography, beyond other biographies, in terms of taking seriously and studying rigorously and documenting as fully as he possibly could what was going on in Malcolm's public, organizational, political, formational life from February 1964, when he broke with the Nation of Islam, to February 1965, when he was assassinated. And in fact, that's 200 pages of a 470-page book. And you pointed out that the travel diaries, along actually with some of the surveillance records and many interviews in relation to not only ex-Nation of Islam members and people that went along in relation to Malcolm X, but principles that were involved in relation to the schism that emerged between Malcolm and the nation over that year. So there's a fair amount of documentation. It's not complete, not least of which, as I understand it, reading the footnotes at the end, and I believe the next to last chapter, because immediately after Malcolm's assassination, many of the papers, many of the documents that involved his work with MMI and OAAU were actually tossed into the garbage, in part because there was a sense of just, anguish, collapse on the part of the family, Betty Shabazz in particular, and wanting to just kind of turn a page and move over from that life. That's its own tragedy. And that's a tragedy, by the way, that we as black people need to be mindful of, is that we often don't take seriously the documentation of the significance of our own lives. I don't mean that as a critique of the late Betty Shabazz. I mean that as something that's a problem in terms of how seriously we take our own history, in terms of understanding the substance of it. But in any event, we may not know much of the story. For instance, going back to Professor Hord's presentation about the OAAU, because the documents may actually not be there. But much of the book is devoted to thinking about that year. And what I'm struck by is that oftentimes when we think about not just Malcolm, but I think the black radical tradition, we think about politics as a goal. Politics is power. Politics is self-determination in the fully realized sense. Politics is about having authority and the capacity to organize your own affairs. But sometimes in talking about it in that way, we miss the ways in which politics is also an action, a process, a way of developing. And this is what, although it is not the only thing to say about those 200 pages, this is what I take from that extensive commitment on Dr. Marable's part to document that 1 year, all out of proportion to the other 38 years of Malcolm X's life, is that that's the year, in Dr. Marable's estimation, that's the most significant in terms of appreciating the ways in which Malcolm X is engaging with politics as an action. What do we find out about that in terms of looking at politics as an action from early 1964 to early 1965? One thing we're certainly finding that many people have emphasized over the course of the day is that politics is something that needs to be expanded from a parochial frame to a global frame. Human rights doesn't make sense until we start engaging what are the correspondences, what are the discrepancies, what are the solidarities, what are the disjunctures between the struggles that different people have in different parts of the world. So here, and I do want to mark it as an achievement. It doesn't mean that the book is beyond criticism, but it is a significant achievement to rigorously ground Malcolm X's life at that moment, that late moment, that significant moment, in terms of all of the ways he's moving around the globe, all of the ways in which he's engaging in different significant struggles, programs, agendas of self-determination. Ones clearly that relate to the continent of Africa and different anti-colonial, revolutionary, self-determination movements all across the continent. But significantly also, ones that relate to the Arab world, the Islamic world. And in that sense, trying to have a sense of what it means to look at how Malcolm X is being transformed by encountering this question of self-determination in global proportion, I think that's significant. And I think it's significant, too, that towards the end of the book, Dr. Marable is saying that we can appreciate the lessons of this in terms of thinking about how to make sense, as he's getting set to depart the world, in our own moment. Because this is a moment where what it means to think about solidarity, not only among black people here in the U.S., not only among people of African descent all around the world, but people of color in radically transformed geopolitical frameworks, which we are in right now over the past 30 or 40 years. We are in a post-colonial world now, as opposed to a colonized world. We are in a world that has different mechanisms of imperialism than was the case. And as devastating as the United States' involvement in wars earlier in the century, and certainly colonial wars capped by the Vietnam War, we are in a different context in terms of what it means to talk about the projection and extension of American military power within the world. So there are lessons in terms of thinking about politics as action, as it's presented in this book, that are instructive for us today, as well as in terms of trying to appreciate or come to some understanding of who Malcolm X was in that moment. Something else, and I'm saying this to be provocative. I think there's also a way, and I really like that phrase coming from the Wolfenstein biography, situational rationality. In some ways, that's a synonym for politics. You get yourself out into the field, You think about what the various kinds of balance of powers are. You understand who the agents are and what kind of energy they're bringing to the field, and you make decisions how to negotiate it. That's being political in a lot of ways. Malcolm X, to his last breath, whether or not we're talking about separatism, nationalism, various kinds of coalition orientations, Pan-African Marxism, so on and so forth, Malcolm X was always about self-determination. That from start to finish was something that was consistent in his ideological makeup. I'm struck, though, in this book, and thinking about that last year, how many times Malcolm X is thinking in situationally rational terms from his perspective, and we're in a position to kind of assess to what extent that was borne out by the history. He's thinking about ways not only to kind of organize and engage black folk in terms of drawing together a political structure, and I think this is actually in some ways even a tradition that can come out of black studies in terms of analyzing race critically in an original sense. W. Du Bois's work in relation to this, Ida B. Wells's work in relation to this. He's also interested in what's situationally rational, moment by moment, in terms of making choices to engage with white people. He gets on the air and he does interviews with Mike Wallace. He goes and speaks at multiple campuses, all during the time when he's engaged fully as the national spokesman of the Nation of Islam and is talking about Yaqub and the mothership and all of that. And that's an interesting lesson about politics too, which is that contra the philosophy of the Nation of Islam, and it's clearly one of the important aspects of his break from it, Malcolm X doesn't necessarily feel that engagement with those people that might potentially be adversaries is something to be avoided from a political standpoint. Because you want to have some sense about how to test, how to diagnose, how to think about, how to leverage what it is that's around you. For these reasons, I really do want to stress that one of the things we can draw from this book, and it's important to analyze this in relation to tradition, in relation to methodology, in relation to documentation, in relation to veracity or truthfulness or grounding or rigor, but the fact that the book is so engaged with politics as an action is something that is a good reminder of a different tradition, I think, also in terms of black studies, which is that when we think about approaching black studies, as Dr. Chajua eloquently presented it, as a project that advances the political prospects of black people, we appreciate the distinction between politics as goal, politics as action. There's a lot to learn in relation to looking at Malcolm X's life. It is important to document that life in order to understand what that distinction means. Humanity, second word. I'm going to be very brief with this, but I think in some ways Dr. Hord's proposal to stick an E in the middle of humanity, Humanity, is powerful, and that tells us something, I think, in a different way for all of the ways in which this book may be seen as moving out towards a mainstream audience, trying to find ways to draw together a broad readership or a broader readership. Black readership is very broad. A readership that is going to go beyond a black readership in the minds perhaps of Dr. Marable, most likely the publishers that he's working for in relation to this. But I think consistently through the book, and certainly at the end of the book, there's a way in which the humanism that is understood to have come up in Malcolm X as a, shall we say, more grown, shall we say more developed, shall we say older, possibly wiser, possibly not, human being. He never moved away, and I think, in my estimation, Marable is trying to stress this towards the end. He never moved away from the idea that humanism was something that happened as a result of color consciousness, rather than something that happened in spite of color consciousness. So, that means then, when he speaks at the end about Malcolm X's vision, about Malcolm X's worldview, that the last point, after talking about Islam, after talking about Pan-Africanism, after talking about black consciousness, after talking about class consciousness, he invokes this idea that Malcolm X was a radical humanist. I don't think Malcolm X makes sense as a radical humanist, and maybe this is a place to criticize his not modifying the term exactly in this way. without appreciating the ways in which radical humanism from Malcolm X was always based upon a sense of race consciousness and race pride. You can be race conscious and race proud and not necessarily feel that another race needs to be denigrated in order to achieve your own pride. Some people would say that that's the evolution, that's the reinvention, that's the transformation from, say, 1960 to 1965. I think it's a little complicated in terms of understanding both where the old Malcolm was and where the new Malcolm was in 1965. Just as I think actually it's complicated when you go deep into Dr. King's writings to understand what Dr. King's relationship was to black pride and race consciousness, certainly from about 1965 to 1968. But in any event, one of the things we can also pull from this, and one of the things that's a lesson today in this supposedly post-racial time, is that this life, and I would say, although I think it's good to continue to argue about it, this book tells us that there is no radical humanism without race pride. There is no radical humanism without a strong and robust and complete and fully developed valuation of the black person as such. Third word, revolution. Politics might sort of root us down in the idea that all that we're talking about is the grubby negotiation between people trying to figure out, how to throw a few more dollars this way, how to steer a few more policies that way. The world of reform, the world of horse trading, the world of brokering, the world that is opposite to the world of revolution, which envisions that the orders that you see around you, the institutions that weigh down on you, are ones that you can actually grasp, shake, and overturn. I think, for example, it's important to appreciate the revolutionary impact of Malcolm X, as everybody who has read the autobiography, as everybody who has encountered any portion of Malcolm X's life would attest to, about how Malcolm X names the problem of white supremacy, I would argue, as no one else had done to that point in the 20th century. And I'm mindful of the fact that Du Bois had spoken to white supremacy, that Garvey had spoken to white supremacy prior to him. What Malcolm X did, in a way that I think exceeded even Garvey and Du Bois, was to take that message of what it meant to produce white privilege, and I'm going to stop very soon so that I can make good on my promise, to take that project of white supremacy and analyze it in front of white people, doing that at those college campuses, doing that on television, presenting it in a way that was revolutionary, not only in terms of the ways in which black people thought about the race question. It was called the Negro problem, up until the point that Malcolm X began to really sort of pick up steam in relation to his impact on the public conversation. But also transforming some, not all, certainly, especially given what we see around today, but some white people in terms of the ways in which they understood the problem of racial consciousness and the question of racial politics. Revolution, though, is also not only about what it means to overturn institutions, but what it means to cultivate and internalize a vision that revolutionary change, in fact, is legitimate. And this is something also that I think is important to assess rigorously in relation to what this biography is trying to present in relation to Malcolm X's life. Here too, I think it's very important to look at what it meant for Malcolm X to travel around the world. He was away 24 weeks out of 52 in the last year of his life, overseas, in other parts of the world. And I think even more so than the idea of a grand, expansive, fairly integrated human community, particularly as he saw during his Hajj and the first of his two trips, what was striking to Malcolm X about traveling the globe in that last year was how revolutionary the world, in fact, had become. Revolutions were happening everywhere as he was going. Nigeria, Ghana, at least in terms of recent years, and so forth. And this sense, again, of appreciating what it means to look at someone who is articulating, representing, and in some ways exemplifying a revolutionary consciousness in an age of revolution is an important lesson in relation to today. Because if there's one distinction, one difference that can be revolution in relation to imagining what might be approaches, what might be agendas, what might present solutions to the kinds of problems and challenges that people are facing. Either the revolution of aggressive force that overturns institutions, or the revolution of transformed consciousness that imagines the prospect of overturning those institutions as legitimate. Both of those should be understood as revolutionary accomplishments. So let me stop there. I'll leave a few more minutes. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to